Hello, and welcome back to the APUS History Curriculum for Era 6. In this video, we will be looking at Topic 6.5, Technological Innovations in the Gilded Age. There's a lot that happens in this time period, so let's get to it. One of the general characteristics of this era was the massive number of inventions that were created in the time period after the Civil War that changed the lives of every American. Labor was available, communications were rapid and improving, and with the ease of transportation increasing due to the railroad expansion, which we'll look at in a moment, raw materials could be more easily accessed and exploited. The need for managers and clerical workers expanded a relatively small middle class, and with higher pay came disposable income that could purchase many of these new convenience products. The Gilded Age for many was about the expansion of a variety of consumer goods, some of which are still around today, or were until fairly recently. This increased production and variety of goods helped to create a consumer economy. Stores were created that sold a variety of goods, divided up into various categories or departments, hence the department store. Macy's was the very first one, located in New York City. Woolworths created a discount retail store, nicknamed a five and dime, as that's what most of their products cost, a nickel or a dime. Meanwhile, Sears, Roebuck & Company created mail-order catalogs so people that lived further away from a department store could purchase the same goods, and eventually branched out into retail locations. Much of this technology was concentrated in the cities and created new possibilities for those that lived there. The skyscrapers changed the skyline of cities, and the invention of the elevator by Elijah Otis allowed buildings to reach new heights. And electric cars and trolleys decreased commuting time. People could reach their destinations faster and faster because of these new methods of mass transit. Cable cars were operational in cities like San Francisco and Chicago by the mid-1800s. Boston completed the nation's first underground subway system in 1897. So, middle-class Americans could live further away from the city's core. Bridges connecting areas previously separated by water, like the Brooklyn Bridge, which connected Manhattan to Brooklyn, plus improved regional transit lines, fueled this trend. Edison, the so-called Wizard of Menlo Park, was a particularly prolific inventor, with almost 1,100 patents between 1869 and 1931. Besides the electric lamp, which was his most well-known invention, he also developed the phonograph, the motion picture camera, film, the mimeograph, and even a method for electric power distribution. That, and the electric lamp, landed him in a battle with George Westinghouse, not about the lamp itself, but in how electricity was to be delivered. Edison's Electric Light Company distributed a kind of electricity called direct current, a low-voltage, relatively harmless source of power. George Westinghouse advocated for alternating current, a different way of distributing electrical power, which produced a higher and potentially deadly voltage that could travel greater distances along power lines. Westinghouse's system required fewer relay stations and less physical infrastructure. Thomas Edison, in an attempt to win the so-called Battle of the Currents, or the War of the Currents, actually helped to invent the electric chair to be used for executions in order to try and win this war using Westinghouse's system. Ultimately, though, his plan didn't work, and AC power is what is in everyone's homes and office buildings and schools when you plug into the wall. The telegraph had been invented by Samuel Morse way back in 1844, but it's during this Gilded Age that telegraph wires multiplied significantly across the land. This tremendously sped up communication, and not only did the telegraph connect various regions of the United States via land, but you also had the laying of a transatlantic cable which connected America to Europe as being a significant achievement. This improved international communication had the effect of creating a market for basic goods, coal, steel, oil, and grain. But it doesn't stop with the telegraph. In 1876, Alexander Graham Bell invented the telephone and soon founded the Bell Telephone Company. And by 1886, more than 150,000 people in the U.S. owned telephones. Really, though, the most important technological innovation was the railroad. Being able to have a quick and easy method of transporting goods created a national market for all of those consumer goods. As we've seen in previous videos and activities, the train itself, the railroad itself, was invented well prior to this time period. And miles of track had already been laid. But the amount of track increased tremendously in the years following the Civil War. Prior to 1871, there was only approximately 45,000 miles of track in the United States. Between 1871 and 1900, another 170,000 miles were added to the nation's growing railroad system. Much of this growth can be attributed to the building of transcontinental railroads. In 1862, Congress passed the Pacific Railway Act, which authorized the construction of such a line. That first railroad was completed on May 10, 1869, joining east and west near Promontory Point, Utah. By 1900, 4 additional transcontinental railroads connected the eastern states with the Pacific coast. Much of this railroad expansion was built with land grants from the federal government, and some states as well. So much land was given to railroad corporations, who could then sell it to finance the actual building of the rail lines, that the amount of land given totaled an area that was roughly the size of the state of Texas. But it isn't just those western lines that were important. By the 1880s, many of the smaller eastern railroads were rapidly consolidating, combining to form larger companies. And they quickly became the largest companies of the time, and much of the economy was dependent on them. Often, railroads had monopolies in certain areas. Perhaps the most famous railroad tycoon who built such monopolies was Cornelius Vanderbilt, commonly referred to as the Commodore. Starting from relatively humble beginnings, he built a massive transportation empire, starting with steamships and moving into railroads. He donated the funds that established Vanderbilt University, which was named in his honor from the money he made. When he died in 1877, he was worth more than $100 million and controlled one of the largest rail corporations in America, the New York Central. By the way, his purchasing power would be the equivalent of almost $3 billion today. He left most of his wealth to his eldest son. His children and grandchildren then used the money that he left them, which within 10 years had more than doubled, to build lavish estates, including the largest private home in America, the Biltmore Estate in Asheville, North Carolina. Actually, it was built by the youngest son of Vanderbilt's oldest son, so one of his grandsons. But this just demonstrates some of the wealth that was created, almost an American royalty of sorts. Another major industry that used new technological innovations was the steel industry, and Andrew Carnegie is the industrialist most associated with this industry. Starting from relatively modest beginning as an immigrant from Scotland, he eventually made investments in steel, which was to become a dominating force in American industry because of a new way in which steel was being produced, through a process known as the Bessemer process, which greatly reduced the cost, while at the same time improved the quality of the steel being produced. With investments in various industries that were connected to steel production, Carnegie could produce steel completely from his own companies. He owned ore fields and mines, railroads and steamships, as well as iron mills, coke ovens, and steelworks. Owning all the steps in a production process is known as vertical integration, and made his companies quite efficient. In 1892, Carnegie established the Carnegie Steel Company, combining all of his assets into just one corporation. By 1901, and nearing retirement, banker J.P. Morgan bought out Carnegie, paying almost $500 million. He then combined that company with several others that he owned to produce an even larger corporation called United States Steel, which was capitalized at $1.4 billion. It was America's first billion-dollar company. Andrew Carnegie, a strong believer in philanthropy, was then determined to spend the rest of his life giving away his fortune. And he almost succeeded, having just $30 million left at the time of his death in 1919. Much of his philanthropic efforts were focused on libraries and education, because one of his wealthy employers, when he had first arrived here in the U.S., had allowed the boys who were working for him to use his personal library in their spare time. And he vowed to do the same if he ever amassed his own wealth. Another prominent industry at the time was the oil industry. Oil was used for lighting, and actually had been for thousands of years as an alternative to candles. Various fuel oils were used, but during the early to mid-century, whale oil was one of the most common choices. But as whales were hunted nearly to extinction, other sources needed to be found, and petroleum proved to be that solution. A product that could be manufactured from petroleum was kerosene, which was used to light up America's homes. Now, petroleum was first discovered in the United States in Pennsylvania in 1859, though eventually electric lighting started displacing kerosene as an illuminant by the time you get to the late 19th century, particularly in urban areas. Though kerosene was still used in rural areas and in various industrial applications. In 1909, the manufacturer of motor fuels would surpass kerosene as the #1 product being made from petroleum. Now, John D. Rockefeller, who is the man most associated with this oil industry, is going to enter the oil business at a fairly young age. But rather than trying to control all aspects of production, he concentrated on the process of refining instead of the discovery or drilling for oils or even the delivery. He founded the Standard Oil Company in 1870 and ran it personally until 1897. Doing things quite a bit differently than how Carnegie had done, he's focusing his companies on just one step in the production of petroleum products, which was the refining process. Eventually controlling 22 out of the 26 refineries in Cleveland alone. And then later, he controlled 90% of the entire oil refining industry in the United States. This is an economic process known as horizontal integration, although the Standard Oil Corporation eventually also adopts the practice of vertical integration as well. This oil industry made Rockefeller the wealthiest man in America ever. He had a personal wealth of approximately $1.5 billion over his lifetime. And though he did give away large portions of his fortune, establishing universities, research facilities, and giving large amounts of money to Baptist missionaries, at the time of his death in 1937, he still had as much wealth as about 1.5% of the entire U.S. economy. And he still ranks as the wealthiest American of all time. The oil industry doesn't just make kerosene, though. There's a lot of other products that are made from petroleum, and many still are today, perhaps actually even more so. Rockefeller actually wanted to minimize waste in his oil refining plants that he had, and so he sought to create products from those wastes of the oil refining industry. One of the biggest waste products of kerosene manufacturing was a flammable liquid that most other companies just simply dumped into nearby rivers. Rockefeller actually took that stuff and used it as a fuel so that he could distill more oil. That waste product was gasoline. He even figured out a way to convert sulfuric acid residue into fertilizer. By 1874, his company branched out into petroleum byproducts, selling paraffin wax that was used for all kinds of things, including chewing gum, as well as residual oil tar and asphalt, which was used in road building. Before long, Standard Oil was manufacturing lubricants for railroads, machine shops, as well as candles, dyes, paints, and industrial acids. His determination to turn waste into profit would give Standard Oil an edge over all of his competitors. Well, that about covers what you need to know about topic 6.5 and the technological innovations of the Gilded Age. Be sure to keep up with your reading, and I'll catch you in the next video.